Welcome, everyone, to our celebration of Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day. We are so thrilled that we're all gathering together to celebrate this extraordinary anniversary of Israel, this tiny little country that has a can-do spirit that has changed everything in terms of our people's history and our future, and the future of the world, to be perfectly honest. And, I think about that as we transition right now from Yom HaZikaron to Yom Ha'atzmaut, where, in the span of 2 days, we are in the lowest lows, where we are mourning our soldiers who have fallen protecting Israel and victims of terror. And the fact that the entire country stops and stands still, literally, in the siren as we memorialize those who have fallen. And then in the space of moments, we turn around and go to the highest highs and celebrate this miraculous tiny country. And that's an experience that no one can have anywhere else in the world. But that we're so, so excited to celebrate Israel Independence Day, Yom Ha'atzmaut. And, Noah, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what you think of when you think of Israel, and when you are telling people about what Israel means to you. What does that say to you? If you had to describe Israel, how would you describe it?
That's such a difficult question to answer. I mean, Israel means so much to me, but I think just going back to the point of the transition between Yom HaZikaron to Yom Ha'atzmaut, there is something so unique in Israel's DNA. And there is this moment when there is this siren that can be heard across, from the northern part of the country to the southern tip. And there is a moment when everything just stops and everyone is united together in their mourning and memorializing these victims of terror and soldiers who have fallen to protect Israel. There's a moment when every single car on the highway just pulls over and everyone stops. And I think that there is something so beautiful and so powerful in that moment of unity. And in answering the question, what does Israel mean to me? There's the obvious answer that it is home, and that is true. This is the homeland of my people. This is where I belong. And Israel is just, to me, it is life itself. It is sound and color and flavors and all of these different communities of people gathering in one location and creating this beautiful color and culture. And to me, Israel is walking through Machane Yehuda on a Friday afternoon, right before Shabbat comes, and they're just yelling and haggling at prices and trying to get rid of all of the produce before the weekend and before Shabbat, and walking through the hustle and bustle and sea of people. And usually it is very, very hot out. So walking through the heat to my favorite little restaurant in the Iraqi part of the shuk and sitting down to a nice fresh bowl of hummus and kube soup and the best salad you'll ever have. And knowing that that's my place and that's where I belong. And there's just this moment of peace amidst all of the crazy, chaotic energy. And that's Israel to me.
It's so true, and Machane Yehuda is my favorite place in all of Israel
Yeah.
because it also represents Israel. You have everybody from every background, every country. Over 70 countries are represented in Israel, and you have that in one place and in one moment, and you hear every language, both of Israelis who are native-born Israelis, Sabras, and you have Israelis who are multi-generation and brand new immigrants or Olim, and that to me is that central meeting place of Israel and that cacophony. And I think that cacophony of noise and sound and life is so much what Israel is, and that innovation and that creativity, and the fact that, quite frankly, Israelis don't follow rules, that rules are merely recommendations. But I think that that's what Israel is in all of its beauty and diversity, and that's what has given us this innovation nation as well, because there is this spirit of can do, and a spirit that just because something was a certain way doesn't mean that it needs to be that way. And I think also about what it's like being new immigrants to Israel, and having lived in Israel and grown up in Israel for you, and serving in the IDF. And I will never ever forget um, when you were named outstanding soldier in your unit, that moment of pride for me, because I, at your ceremony was thinking about, this is not just our people's story, this is our family's story, and it's everybody's story all at once. The longing for being in Israel and the generations who have said L'shana haba'a b'Yerushalayim, and us being able to really stand up to that and say we are here, and then for you to be in the IDF and to protect the country, and then to be outstanding soldier, for me was kind of that perfect moment. The fact that one of your brothers was born in Jerusalem, he's, our Sabra, and he's so proud of not only being a Sabra, but of being a Yerushalmi, being born in Jerusalem. And your other brother who had his bar mitzvah at the Kotel, and particularly at the pluralistic area of the Kotel. So that this was, again, not just our people's history, but our own family's history. And those are moments for me that I feel our entire family that is there with us celebrating this moment together.
I couldn't agree more. And this is something that we've spoken about at length, but our family story, coming from Poland, settling in Cuba, and having to relocate again, and throughout this entire just generations. I mean, I think that our family, generations in the making, is arriving in Israel. And as you mentioned, just this yearning to be able to call Israel home and having the ability to defend it and the privilege. I think this is just, it's something that I will never forget for the rest of my life. And just one more thing about immigration. I think that there is something so special about Israel. And to me, every time I get off a plane at Natbag, at the airport in Tel Aviv, it's this homecoming, and it's a sense of walking into the home of your extended family. I mean, Israel to me is Fridays when our neighbors would bake an extra challah loaf and bring it over, and a pot of soup and bring it over just so that we would have something extra to eat for Shabbat. It's just this extended family, and it's unlike any other place that I have had the privilege of visiting before.
The other thing that I was just thinking about is how the reality of Israel is so often not known or not understood. And I think about, actually, this sounds so funny, but I always think about it, how the gas station near our house is actually representative of the real Israel. That at that gas station, we also have a greengrocer right there, and a tiny little, we'll call it a restaurant or a cafe, and everybody comes together in this spot. You have Haredim, you have Palestinians, you have Israelis of every stripe and every religious affiliation and non-affiliation, and everybody comes together, and everybody is having coffee together, and everybody is talking together. And that to me is the reality of Israel that most people don't know, and that I hope that most people will actually learn about, because that to me is the celebration of Israel, the reality of, this dynamic, diverse, extraordinary country that is so full of life and that celebrates everybody, and that there's a place for everybody. And that to me is why I'm so happy to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day.
My name is Philip Levine. I was born in Brooklyn in 1928, and I was in college when I went to the company that was getting volunteers to fight in Israel. I applied for a passport and was refused by the FBI, and I was then able to get on a ship which was destined to go to Israel, which had been bought by the Shushu, the Israeli underground, and we were a crew of 32 people, and we sailed the ship across the Atlantic to Marseille, where they loaded people on the ship to go to Israel. We took 1,250 immigrants who were all DPs, displaced persons, and took them to Haifa. And I have some pictures of the ship, which was called the Mala. This is the picture of the ship. Now these are photographs that I took, and here's another one of the people on board the ship. You can see how crowded we were, and this is the other photograph of the ship. We then went, and I got off the ship, went into the volunteer at the Sarafan at that time, which was getting the volunteers, and I was given a job in the Israeli Air Force, where I served for the rest of the time that I spent in Israel. I made Aliyah in 1968, moved to Israel with my family, and I now have 3 daughters, all living in Israel, 16 grandchildren, and over 35 great-grandchildren.
Why?
These are some of the photographs that I took at the time when I was in Israel. This is a picture of myself when I served, and this was the passport that I received from Haifa, from the American Embassy, which was on return to go back to the States. It was a passport that said one way only. I could go use the passport to go back to the States. Passport is valid only for use in returning to the United States. This was issued then in 1949 by the American consulate in Haifa. Israel is my whole being. I like living here. I was in business here. When I came to Israel, I went into the lighting business, and then I became a sales of real estate, and I now make wine. I taught people how to make wine, and I became an expert in the equipment and winemaking. I wish that we should all live and be well, and we should all volunteer and help others join us here in Israel, which is our homeland for all the Jews all over the world. I'm happy with the agreement that they've made with the Arab states. I'm pleased with our connection with the United States, and I think that we have it made. We live here, we eat here, we breed here, and this is the place for all Jews that would like to make a Aliyah. Thank you.
Shalom to you all. My name is Phyllis Heimowitz, and this is my husband, Erwin Yitzhak Heimowitz. When we were asked to participate in this film, I pondered what I would say to you. What can someone who came on Aliyah from New York 53 years ago say? Yes, 53 years. What made a 29-year-old woman, a teacher in the New York City school system, and a successful lawyer in New York, age 34, leave our entire families, our jobs, our way of life, the country we were born in? the richest, most powerful country in the world. What made us leave to a new, tiny, tiny country, only 20 years old, with a population of approximately 2.5 million people? Well, in order to answer that question, we have to go back in a time machine. Hold on. Time machines don't always land where they are supposed to land. Sometimes they land in Alaska, but we're not going for Alaska. We're on the right track, and we have landed in the apartment of Phyllis and Erwin Heimowitz in New York. Successful landing. And it is Monday morning, June 5th, 1967, and we are on the way to work. In the background, we suddenly hear the television announcer say, "War broke out today in the Middle East." Our hearts banged, and we knew that the situation in Israel was dangerously close to military confrontation. But here it was, war. 3 very powerful Arab countries, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan, were going to attack Israel with one aim in mind, and that is annihilation. My friend Ruth, Zichrono Levacha, who lived through that period in Israel, told me that the people were instructed by the authorities to build trenches all over, and they were warned, however, not to build the trenches too close one next to another, because in case of military bombardment, if the trenches were further apart, the authorities said, quote, "We might save some of the children." Also, many people were instructed to build graves, temporary graves in the parks. So this is what the situation was. Listening to the news, my husband and I looked at each other. How can we be safe here in America, safe and sound, when our homeland is in danger? We looked into each other's eyes, and this is true, it's absolutely true what I'm saying to you. We made a promise to each other. The promise was that we were going to come and live in Israel. There would never, ever be a situation that we would not be in our homeland when she was in danger. We're going to go to Israel, we're going to love her, and we're going to help take care of her. On Sunday, October 21st, 1968, our families came to say goodbye to us at JFK International Airport. I was holding our firstborn child, Daniel, who was 5 months old when he got on that airplane. He was dressed in blue and white for the occasion. How can I even begin to explain to you what it's like to leave a mother, a father, 2 sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins? You know, I can't explain it. I could just tell you that it was an absolutely awesome experience. And we had no family at all in Israel. The El Al plane soared into the sky. Yitzchak and I had kept our promise. We were going on Aliyah. When we walked down the stairs, I was holding Daniel, and I bent down and I kissed the ground. I have two pictures that I must show you. These pictures are very precious to me. They're 53 years old. Here is us at the Western Wall. Yitzchak, Phyllis, and baby Daniel. It was a very special occasion. It's amazing how time flies by. It seems as if we were just standing there yesterday. Another picture. I moved closer to the Western Wall with Danny in my hands, sweet little Danny in our other hand, and he took his little hand and he put it on the stones of the wall. And this is a picture indeed to be treasured. So this, in short, is how we came to Israel and why we came to Israel. And now, to part with you, I'm going to do something that all grandmothers do. And you'll have to forgive me. It's not our fault. It's simply in our genes. We just can't help it. I want to show you a picture of our tribe that Yitzchak and I built in Israel. These are our grandchildren. We are sailing on the Kinneret, and all of them are sitting around Yitzchak and myself. An awesome picture, a really awesome picture. May God bless them and watch over them and keep them safe. Two of the older grandchildren sitting here are entering the Israel Defense Forces very shortly. Yitzchak?
Yes,
We kept our promise, didn't we?
we sure did.
We kept our promise.
Yes.
Chag Sameach, dear friends, on the eve of our Independence Day. My name is Ephraim Lapid. I am a PhD in political science at Bar-Ilan University and the Brigadier General Reserve in the Israeli military. I'm very glad to share with you some thoughts about Israel and the Jewish world on this occasion on behalf of the American Jewish Committee. I was born in Israel, that was at that time Palestine, 79 years ago. My parents came from Lithuania. Lithuania in Europe was one of the most important Jewish communities with a long tradition of Zionism, Judaism, and open-minded society. I am very connected to the heritage of this community. Four of my father's sisters, my aunts, survived from Shoah. My grandfather, Shlomo Yitzchak, and my uncle, Dov Isaac, were murdered in Shoah. So the Shoah was a topic which was very strong in my childhood, and still now I am very connected to the importance of Shoah, and I am lecturing on these topics in various circles. In my military career, I was an intelligence officer, and I am very involved with the heritage of the intelligence for the existing soldiers in the IDF, and many occasions in the world where the history and the current affairs of the Israeli intelligence is a topic in various panels. Nowadays, I'm lecturing in Bar Ilan University on topics of national security and involved in many Israeli associations on social and cultural life of Israel. In the last decade, I made my PhD on the Israeli intelligence, and last year my book in English on the Israeli intelligence community was published. I'm very glad to be a partner of Jewish life in Israel and in the world, and feel the responsibility and the commitment of Israeli societies to do it in various fields. I wish you and us a very happy Independence Day of Israel, which is also the Independence Day of Jewish life. All the best.
What Israel means to me. First of all, it means protecting my country, the country that I was born in, the country that I live in, the country that I will die in. I'm right now standing on the border of Lebanon as part of my reserve duty, and many millions of Israelis just do the same, serve in the military and then go to their reserve duty. Others serve in national service. So first of all, it's about being a patriot, about defending your own country. But you cannot do that without people. And I'm very proud to be an Israeli with a famous Israeli DNA, creativity, imagination, giving solutions, especially in times of emergency. This is my country. I will not trade it in any other country in the world. Happy Independence Day. Happy Yom Ha'atzmaut.
As a young child, I used to wave to every airplane that passed overhead. "I'm waving to my aunt," I would announce with great authority to anyone who asked. She lives in Israel. I didn't understand that airplanes were only vehicles by which we could get to Israel, but I always felt special because I had family there. With each visit to Israel, my connection became stronger. It wasn't only where my beloved aunt, uncle, and cousins lived, it was also where I felt most Jewishly alive and connected. By the time I was in high school, I decided that I would someday make Aliyah. Finally, in the year 2000, once I was married and a mother of 2 young children, my dream seemed to be coming true. My husband received a fellowship for Jewish educators to spend 2 years studying in Jerusalem. We were over the moon. We would go and ease our way into our life in Israel, and if all went well, we would make Aliyah at the end of the 2 years. We arrived in Israel on a hot summer day in July 2000, our children dressed in blue and white. It was such a hopeful time. Peace with the Palestinians seemed around the corner, and the .com boom made the world flush with economic prosperity. I wish I could say my Israel story ended here, with a joyful arrival, followed by a successful Aliyah. But that's not what happened. Our 2 years in Israel were heart-soaringly wonderful in so many ways. Our children quickly learned to speak Hebrew with perfect little Israeli accents. We traveled the country, hiking and seeing the sights of our people's history. We formed a community of close friends. We were enveloped by our loving family. But the 2 years were also very, very difficult. The Second Intifada broke out just a few weeks after we arrived, and it dashed all hopes for peace. Terrorists were detonating suicide bombs way too close to the streets that we were traveling on every day. When we woke up every morning, we never knew what tragedy we would have to absorb before laying our heads down that night. The .com bubble burst, taking with it much of our hard-earned Aliyah savings. But despite all of this, we plan to stay in Israel. More than ever, we felt that our lot was with the Jewish people there. Israel felt like our home, like our future, until something happened that changed everything. My father was diagnosed with brain cancer back in America. His doctors gave him scarcely over a year to live. We made the very difficult decision to return to the United States at the end of my husband's fellowship. I just couldn't bear the thought of staying in Israel while my father was dying in America. As the date of our departure from Israel grew closer, the moment of getting on the plane loomed very large in my mind, and I became more and more anxious. I felt like a traitor to my people and to myself. Speaking to a friend one day, herself an Ola from America, I said, "My whole life I've been Laura who loves Israel. Who am I once I get on that plane?" I think I'm going to remember her response for the rest of my life. She said, "You're still Laura who loves Israel." It would take me a while to understand what she meant. As it turned out, I was too busy juggling our now 3 young children, our third is our Sabra, born in Jerusalem, and their strollers, car seats, and diaper bags to focus on the fraught moment of getting on the plane. But as I found my footing in my new community in America and began a new career as a Jewish history and Israel studies educator, I realized that love for Israel takes many forms. Yes, living there is one form, but devoting myself to Israel education and igniting passion for Israel in the hearts of American Jews is another form. I feel blessed each and every day to have a career that involves transmitting understanding and joy about Israel to Jews of all ages, from kids to senior citizens. I am so grateful that my work at AJC revolves in so many ways around strengthening the relationship between Israeli and diaspora Jewry. I believe in Jewish peoplehood, that the connection of Jews throughout the world to one another and to our rich history and tradition is something to be nurtured and celebrated. I believe that Israel in many ways belongs to the whole Jewish people, and that we must all contribute to making it the best state it can be. On this Yom Ha'atzmaut 5781, I celebrate the miracle that is our homeland, and I'm filled with gratitude that I'm able to spend my days as Laura who loves Israel.
Hello, my name is Fanta Prada. I am a restaurant owner and a lawyer and a model. I came to Israel 30 years ago from Ethiopia on my birthday, which was the best gift I could ever get. In the recent years, I am promoting the Ethiopian culture in Israel. I opened a successful restaurant and a museum focusing on the Ethiopian Jews. Israel is my love, is my home, is a dream come true. It is where my parents and grandparents longed to be, to come back home. Israel is a love story. It's a romance. It's a love at first sight. Israel is a daydream. What would I wish for? I wish for our Yom Ha'atzmaut. I wish Israel that we would learn to appreciate all the goodness of the country. My parents taught me that Israel is valuable. They sacrificed their lives to get here. The long journey was hard and I need to appreciate it. Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach. መልካም ነፃነት ቀን ይሁንልን ለሁላችን ባለንበት።
Hi, my name is Ariel Lapson. I currently live in Seattle, Washington, but I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I am the program officer for experiential Jewish education at the Samus Foundation, which is the largest Jewish foundation in Washington state, supporting intensive immersive Jewish education locally and various initiatives in Israel. My relationship with Israel began at a very young age. I felt this inherent connection and affinity for Judaism in Israel, which was really fostered by my dad, who, as far back as I can remember, was always talking about Israel and giving me books and articles about Jewish history and kind of instilling that Jewish education and Israel education at home. For my family, who had fled anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union in 1979, Israel was remarkable. I felt passionately when I spoke about Israel as a teen, thanks to my family, and I knew that at some point it would come to play an integral role in my life. My first semester of college at Emory University, which I chose as my college because it had a large percentage of Jews, and in my high school of 1,700 kids, I was maybe one of 6 Jewish students. I signed up for a freshman seminar on Israeli culture and society, and I was completely hooked. Everything Israel was my passion. The following summer, at 19, I went on my first trip to Israel through Birthright, and the experience confirmed for me what I had felt for so long. I connected with Israelis and the country in a deep and emotional way. After that, I signed up for every subsidized trip I could find. I studied abroad my junior year at Tel Aviv University, and after finishing college, 1 month later, basically as soon as I physically could, I moved to Jerusalem to begin a master's degree program at Hebrew University. I didn't know it then, but my first Shabbat in Jerusalem, I actually met my husband. He was a Hayal Boded for 5 years who served as a commander in the Combat Engineering Corps and made Aliyah when he was 18 from Chicago. Ironically, his parents were also Russian and had left the Soviet Union as refuseniks in 1982. 2 years after I officially made Aliyah, after I had met him, I started working in international trade shows and various industries. A few years later, we got married in Jerusalem, where we met, and moved back to the US to be closer to family. Since coming back, I've had the opportunity to work in the Jewish nonprofit sector, dedicating my professional life to connecting all generations of the American Jewish community with Israel. Whether it was through creating and leading Israel education programs at federations, or supporting Teen Israel Experience programs with grants through the Samus Foundation, or now through my volunteer work on the AJC Seattle Board and AJC Access Working Group on U.S.-Israel relations, I live and breathe Israel and fostering strong connections between the U.S. and Israel. I care for Israel because for me it really is home. It's where I feel most alive and where I experience some of the most amazing milestones in my life. I also care for Israel from the perspective of Jewish history. If you have even a small sense of what the Jewish people have been through just in the 20th century alone, you cannot deny that this country is a modern-day miracle. It is a blessing that we're alive to witness the existence of an independent Jewish state, and after thousands of years without protection, we now have one of the most sophisticated and effective militaries in the world to protect us. On Israel's Independence Day, I hope that Israel will continue to flourish as a Jewish state and democracy, that the personal relationships between Israelis and American Jews will continue to increase and deepen, and that 50 and 100 years from now, we will look back with pride and astonishment at how Israel has made a tremendous impact on the world. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Alden. I am originally from California, but recently moved to Tel Aviv, Israel. I was a part of AJC's board in San Francisco and also currently serve as chair of global leadership for AJC Access, and hopefully we'll be getting more involved with AJC in Israel. My relationship with Israel is a lifelong one. My dad is Israeli, Moroccan Israeli, and so I have a lot of family here and grew up coming here most years of my life, learning about the people of Israel, the food, the history, the culture, the language, and Israel has always had a special place in my heart. And I think growing up in California, I was very involved in Hebrew school, Jewish summer camps, USY, other Israel-related activities, but it wasn't until I went to university that I felt really compelled to find a way to better advocate for Israel, the right for Israel to exist, to fight against anti-Semitism. And so I was certainly very excited to be acquainted with AJC and all the good work that AJC does and build my relationship with that community. My my wish for Israel on this Yom Ha'atzmaut is to continue to build an inclusive society for Israelis, for Jews, all types of Jews in Israel and the diaspora, and to continue to find the kesher, the connection between Jews and Israelis globally, and also the rest of the world, and how we can continue to be a stalwart for democracy, for pluralism, for change, for innovation, for good in Israel, in the Middle East, and throughout the world. And my hope is that a government can be formed and that Israel will continue to build an inclusive society for everyone.
Hi, I am Maya Peterson. I'm 16 years old and I live in Rosh Hashanah. I was born to a Jewish and Israeli mom and to a Christian and Danish dad, and my family from both sides lives in Denmark. And once in a year, me and my family fly to Denmark to visit both of the sides. One of my cousins made an aliyah to Israel and now she lives with us. Compared to my family that does not live with me, I'm doing different activities. I'm right now in combat fitness that prepare the youth to the army. And I'm also in a youth movement that's called Anor Arvet Valomed, and we have trips, social meetings, and sometimes we have camps. I'm also in a special music program that lasts 6 years, and right now I'm in my 5th year. And Israel is really, really important to me. I was born here and I have really, really good friends. And I wish Israel to keep growing and maybe make more peace with more countries.
Hi, my name's Abe Baker Butler. I'm a gap year student. I'll be attending Yale University next fall. This year I have the pleasure of working in the office of the CEO at AJC. What does Israel mean to me? Israel, in my mind, is a very special country. I've never lived in a world without Israel, but I am extremely cognizant of all that Israel brings to the world in its existence. Israel is there creating the future today. And to me, that is what Israel means to me, a universally important nation that moves us forward as a global community. As a Jewish person, as a young Jewish person, Israel also holds deep and special meaning to me. As the homeland of the Jewish people, as a nation where the whole diversity, the full spectrum of Jewish observance is present, as a nation that is not perfect, as a nation that has challenges, but a nation that is constantly growing, constantly improving, and that is a pluralistic democracy, a democracy tolerant of all people, a democracy in the Middle East. That is all quite impressive to me. And as a Jewish person, it gives me great pride to know that Israel exists. I feel a strong connection, a deep connection to the story of Israel. And I believe Israel is inherently intertwined in the story of our people and the future of the Jewish people. I had the pleasure of spending 5 weeks in Israel last summer, actually 2 summers ago, summer 2019. And those 5 weeks were some of the best 5 weeks of my life. Not because of the touristic activities, but because of the feeling that one has when they are living and working and learning in the land of Israel. And it is amazing to me and a source of eternal inspiration to see all that Israel has accomplished, and to know that as a Jewish person, even though Israel is not my home country, that I am part of that journey and able to play a role and interact with Israel as it continues. I also think Israel's story of rising from the ashes, a nation overcoming adversity to become a model for the world, is deeply, deeply inspiring. And it's inspiring to me personally, and it inspires me as I think about how I want to work as an activist in our country, in the United States. And so Israel holds deep and special meaning to me, and I am proud to be part of this AJC program to observe and celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut.
Hello, everybody. You've just heard beautiful stories from 4 generations of different Israelis and Americans and their connections to the state of Israel. I've been fortunate to have been coming to Israel now for close to 40 years. Israel is our home. Jerusalem is our eternal capital. And it is such an incredible country. It's a country that lives in spite of its challenges, in spite of its neighborhood. It thrives. It gives us so much joy. And to know that we have Israel as Americans, to know that we have Israel as our center in a way is so incredibly comforting. I do business here, I do charity here. It's a privilege, of course, to represent AJC around the world and in Israel, because Israel is so important to the Jewish people, to the diaspora. I often say that Israel needs the diaspora as much as the diaspora needs Israel. This is just an incredible country, and it's a place of joy, it's a place of sadness. And I'm reminded that we have, and what's actually a beautiful story, that we have our Memorial Day that runs literally into Independence Day in Israel. And why? It's effectively the same story that we just read in Passover, which is from darkness to light, from slavery to freedom. We go from the horrors of remembering the Memorial Day into the joy, directly into the joy of Independence Day. And it's really a very powerful message. So thank you for being a part of this. And now, please join me as we hear a very special rendition of Hatikva.